Hey folks, this is Rhykker, and Diablo 4 2.0, the full rework is out on the test server, and we're going to give my first impressions here of day one. We're calling this Diablo 4 2.0 because it is a massive overhaul of core foundational systems, specifically itemization. We've gone through all the details in past videos, but in short, cutting down on affixes, removing all of those damage on Tuesdays affixes, adding in new, real, genuine crafting systems, then on top of that making big changes to Helltide, and also adding a new endgame system, the Pits. And those of you who watched my stream yesterday know that I went through quite the journey of how I was feeling about this 2.0. I load into the game, I start looking at some gear, some item affixes, and I'm thinking, oh no, oh no. I feel like I'm looking at Diablo 3 itemization, and I get this sinking feeling in my chest. And I'm thinking, oh no, we've pushed things too far. Now things are just as simple and straightforward as Diablo 3 itemization, which, it wasn't bad, but it was just not interesting. The issue with Diablo 3's affixes is that they're just so straightforward that for 95% of builds, you pretty much want the exact same affixes on every piece of gear. There's no variety really, it's always obvious what's best in slot affixes. And I was looking at the D4 affixes and I'm thinking, oh no, we're gonna get exactly this now. So legendaries in Diablo 4 now have 3 random affixes plus a 4th legendary affix. So it's, like main stat plus maybe vitality plus a resistance, or, depending on the itemization slot exactly, it's gonna look something like that. That's where my head was at. Then I started looking into the tempering. The tempering, that's the new crafting system, one of the 2 new crafting systems. And this is whereby you are going to add 2 additional affixes onto an item. So you're gonna have your 3 that you roll with, plus you still have enchanting, so you can reroll one of those, and then you get to add 2 extra affixes. And these are completely different from those regular base 3. Sometimes there's some overlap, but you're gonna find in the world tempering manuals. It seems that running Nightmare Dungeons gets them to drop quite a bit. So once you find a tempering manual, you learn the recipe forever, just like in Diablo 3. And each tempering manual has within it about 6 different possible affixes. When you temper the item, you pick a manual and you're randomly selecting one of those 6. There's dozens to hundreds of different tempering manuals. And as I'm looking through some of them seem interesting. A lot of them are increasing the radius of your skill, which is really cool. Sometimes it's adding a second projectile, which is also cool. But then sometimes we're seeing things that look more like the conditional modifiers that we got rid of. And again, so the hyper-conditional modifiers, damage on Tuesdays is sort of how we abbreviate them. That's the, deal extra vulnerable damage to crowd-controlled enemies, right? That's a hyper-conditional affix. Those have been removed from the base affixes, but they're not out of the game entirely is what I realized. You can still find them, for instance, in some of these tempered recipes or in other places. And so again, I'm a little demoralized there. I'm like, oh, so we still do have these hyper-conditionals, but my negative emotion started to turn around when I realized, okay, yes, we do have these sort of hyper-conditionals, but now it's going to be your choice to seek them out. The main issue with those hyperconditionals was I'm getting random loot and it has a bunch of hyperconditional affixes, and now I got to figure out, okay, is having this hyperconditional better than this other hyperconditional? And it's just a lot of burden on comparing and contrasting items and creates a lot of junk loot. But now that is a system that you effectively opt into instead of being forced upon you, it is a much better system. And you can actually now tailor something for your build specifically, as opposed to have to figure out what to do with all these random affixes. Another thing about the tempering recipes that was a little discouraging at first is that some of the tempered manuals have things where no matter what you roll, it's useful for you. I like those the most, but some of them, only one of the 6 would be useful to you and the other 5 are useless. So since you cannot deterministically select one, you're randomly getting one of the 6. Well, if you don't get what you want, you gotta re-roll. And you only have so many re-roll attempts before the item is done, you can no longer temper it. This is something that I also had concerns about. In my limited play experience, it did not prove to be a problem. When I did get to tempering items, I actually enjoyed engaging with the tempered system. I did find myself having to re-roll some items, and I guess luckily I didn't brick an item yet. But as of now, despite some preliminary concerns, I am, on a first impressions basis, sold on tempering. Now, how am I going to feel after a week? And that's something that I want to do is revisit PTR after a week of playing this and seeing, okay, now, did the charm wear off? That's something that I'm always trying to keep in mind. Is this just exciting now because it's new and novel, and is it going to become frustrating in the future? We'll only have to find out then. But for now, I actually really quite enjoy tempering. But before we move on, a word from this video's sponsor, NVIDIA. Ray tracing has come to Diablo 4. Ray-traced shadows and reflections are a technology that makes light more realistic. It's accurately modeling the physics as opposed to just imitating it. I'm a huge graphics nerd, I have been all my life. When I was a kid, this is the technology that I dreamed of. Diablo 4 uses a very realistic graphic style, and ray tracing just goes that extra mile to make everything feel that much more realistic and immersive. So with ray-traced reflections enabled, you're gonna see water and blood, whatever liquid, create dynamic reflections. So with ray tracing off, my lightning balls do nothing. With ray tracing on, my lightning balls cast reflections. You can even see in this lake over here, with ray traced reflections, we're seeing reflections of the scenery in this body of water. And then ray traced shadows is just gonna make your shadows that much more realistic. It's gonna model the exact sources of light and the way shadows will naturally sort of fall off and become more blurry and faded as they grow distant from the source. And if you're worried about performance hits, well, there's also DLSS 3 in the game. This technology basically leverages AI to double your performance in up to 4K. And then NVIDIA's reflex technologies can ensure maximum performance with regards to latency, so there's zero input lag between what you're doing and what you're seeing. To enable ray tracing, just go into your options here, navigate to graphics, scroll all the way down to ray tracing, and you can toggle them on. Same thing with DLSS 3, go to options, go to graphics, and then you can select your DLSS performance mode. And then reflex is also right beneath that. Also, if you're on an RTX 40 card, enable frame generation to get even more frames per second. Now you'll note that I said that legendary gear has 3 affixes, rare gear has 2, and no, there is no way to add a third affix. What that means is that rare gear, once you're level 100, you are never ever gonna equip. It's always gonna be trash, it's always gonna be just salvaged. We do need crafting mats, and I would personally rather just get crafting mats than get an item that I have to turn into crafting mats. But the fact that they're not removing them from the game means that in the future we can always find something to do with yellow items. Similarly, you know, blues and whites as well are completely useless in the end game. I presume yellows actually become obsolete quite early. As soon as you're getting legendary gear rather consistently, you're never going to really pick a 2 affix item over a 3 affix item. But again, as part of the foundation, maybe in the future we can add, you know, rune words. We can add other systems that can only engage with different tiers of items. Maybe something could be done there. For now, though, yes, they are completely useless in the end game. However, we're not getting flooded with drops. So first off, in World Tier 4, only Ancestral gear drops. Feels great to not have to, okay, which one are Ancestral, which one are Sacred. Same thing in World Tier 3, you're only getting Sacred gear. So right away you know, okay, I'm a level 100 character, any yellow item I don't have to look at, automatically salvaged. And this actually lends into the greater affix system. So you have a chance for some items to roll with a greater affix, which you can have one or more greater affixes. It becomes increasingly unlikely to get multiple greater affixes, but a greater affix is one that rolls like 25% higher than it normally would. And this is going to be all of your GG endgame gear. So at level 100, the endgame gearing loop is basically anything that's yellow, you salvage. Anything that's legendary, you also salvage, unless it has a greater affix. You're not going to bother equipping anything that doesn't have a greater affix at endgame itemization. So it makes it quite easy to salvage everything. And you might be asking, well, what about the aspects? Well, that's the Codex of Wisdom changes. Now, whenever you salvage any legendary, that legendary aspect automatically goes into the Codex of Wisdom to upgrade the base Codex of Wisdom power. So if you had a perfect 10 out of 10 roll on your affix, on your aspect rather, now you permanently have that in your Codex of Wisdom. It's not a one-time use, it is a permanent upgrade. You can now always imprint at maximum. So you really don't have to fuss over checking what aspects to keep anymore. There is no more stash burden. I'm a compulsive hoarder, and after a full day of playing, I had like 1 or 2 items in my stash. Under a normal day of playing a D4, I would have at least a full stash tab. So the Codex now contains every single aspect in the game. You can't get them all from dungeons, but even the ones you get from drops, they will go into the Codex of Wisdom. So again, all these changes together with the obsoleting of rares, with the Codex of Wisdom, my loop after filling up my inventory with items, again, salvage all yellows, salvage all legendaries that don't have a greater affix, and then look at the ones with greater affixes and see, okay, is this an upgrade over what I have? And if it is, then I don't have to worry about what do I do, like how do I juggle my aspects? I just salvage the one that I was wearing. If it had the highest aspect that I've ever acquired, it's going into the Codex anyway, and then I can just, again, infinitely imprint. There's just no more burden on stash space. So stash management feels so much better. All the frustration. I had a video from months ago where I was actually defending Diablo 4, but I conceded that like my greatest frustration with the game is about the itemization and the burden on stash and the burden of having to compare, and all of that is just gone. It is so smooth now. Now we also have lower drop rates, significantly lower drop rates. So you're not going back to town nearly as often to have to vendor all of your garbage. And my understanding as well is that drop rates on PTR are higher than they will be on live. There's something like 50 to 100% higher. So extrapolating out, we're going to be playing for a significant amount of time before we have to go back to town to vendor. It could be easily like 50 minutes of solid play before your stash is full and you're going back to vendor, which compared to the current state of the game, I mean, if you are picking up everything, which, you know, most people at endgame just aren't anymore because there's too much stuff dropping, you know, it could be easily, 5 minutes or less before you're full. This means we are spending more time playing. It feels better. It felt, again, burdensome in the past. So many things are dropping. It's like, okay, I don't have room for this. So let me open up my inventory. Okay, I'm going to drop this yellow item so I can make room for this legendary. And just that doesn't happen anymore. Quick note on gems. Gems are better now. Not much to say. It's not like revolutionary, but gems just, they're more straightforward, less conditional buffs. Well, let's talk a bit more about the flow of gameplay, which is really what started to sell me on, and really turn me around on this rework of Diablo 4. And it takes us to Helltide as well as the Pit. Now, Helltide, wow. For the longest time, I was saying, hey, you know, Season 2 introduced Bloodtide, is what we called it. It's Blood Harvest, and that was so fun. Blood Harvest Season 2 was such a big win, and we're like, I really wanted them to just add Blood Harvest into the game permanently. It's such a fun overworld activity when you have such a high density of monsters and you have these summoning areas where it brings in waves of enemies and all other people can jump in and participate. And then in Season 3, there was some overworld activities as well that had something similar where you can summon in waves of enemies, and sometimes you summon like an uber boss, or a tougher monster that comes in. All these like little things that were really fun and engaging activities. And I'm like, just put that into the base game. And they did. They just did it in Helltide. Instead of adding those other systems permanently, they said, well, we're just going to take the best of those and put it into Helltide. And that's exactly what they did. Helltide now accessible even in earlier world tiers, but I mostly did it in World Tier 4, and Helltide is so much more fun now. It incorporates, again, the best elements. It's taken those systems that were effectively beta tested, and it built them up into full things. So you had the Bloodseekers in Season 2, which were like mirrors of the player classes, and at the time they were basically just a reskin, like a red reskin of a player model. Now they're fully different 3D models, but they're still like, well, that's a necromancer, that's a druid, and they have those powers and stuff, and it feels so fun. And again, it's taken that excitement from those other events and now put it into Helltide. I know a lot of people found Helltide to be tedious, but now with the increased density, the new different events, it's more engaging, right? There's more player agency in engaging with, I'm going to do this little objective to destroy that, and now I'm going to use this heart that I got to summon a mega boss wave. On the note of the mega boss wave, I will say there's this one like crazy, it's almost like a world boss, honestly, that you can summon. You fight waves of enemies similar to how Bloodtide worked, but then you get this super uber boss, and holy crap, what a fight. The difficulty just ramps up like 100-fold. It almost feels like it ought to be a world boss that if you don't have a bunch of people there, right? I guess I was unlucky and I only fought it by myself or with like one other person, and we were getting stomped. We eventually beat her, but like it took a solid 5 minutes or more. With a lot of like challenging mechanics. She kept summoning as well waves of those Bloodseekers. Quite an epic fight, but it did feel overtuned difficulty-wise. Lots of drops in the end, but it still feels like it wasn't worth the time investment. But that's always something that can be tuned, or, you know, maybe when we're all in the GG endgame builds, she's gonna get one shot bonked, just like a world boss, who knows. But yeah, the other exciting change to the Helltide is this new GTA type system where as you do more stuff in Helltide, you're building up a threat meter. You have like 3 threat levels, and that keeps ramping up the challenge until you finally hit 3-star threat level, and then a champion of hell gets summoned, like waves of enemies get summoned on you, plus a champion of hell, like another Bloodseeker, right? So lots of exciting stuff. The Helltide is just a lot more fun and engaging now. Also, Goblins, I've mostly just ran into them in Helltide, a lot more fun now because they can kind of drop anything. I killed a goblin and I got some Uber Boss drops. I'm like, oh, sorry, not drops, materials, like summon materials. I'm like, oh, that's great. And I think just in general, those Uber Boss summon mats can now drop a lot more randomly in different places instead of having to so specifically target farm them. So now you're just kind of getting them as part of the regular gameplay loop, and it's exciting to like randomly find some of these materials in just like little jackpot moments. Then there was the Pit. So the Pit was a system that I was very skeptical about because the Pit is basically just Diablo 3 Greater Rifts. And I'm like, okay, I mean, those were fun, they were fine, but there was more that you can do with them. And I think what I just did not expect from the Pit, it's super basic, right? Like, it's just, here's 10 minutes, you have 10 minutes to kill as many monsters as you can to summon a boss, and beat the boss, do it all within the 10 minutes, and you get reward. And then you can keep going into higher and higher Pit levels, just like Greater Rifts. Despite its simplicity, I did not expect it to be just so fun. It's just, it feels so good to just be able to run through a dungeon and kill monsters and not have to pick up anything, not have to interact with anything, not have to do any side quests. You just run through and you're killing things, and it just feels good. Who would have thought? Who would have thought that in a game that's just about going around killing monsters, the most fun thing to do is to just go around killing monsters? I almost felt relieved. I almost felt like I was at home in the Pit, just like, this is what I feel like I should be doing in this game. This is the gameplay loop right here. I just felt the Pit had like this perfect flow state of the game. So again, loot only drops at the Rift Guardian, the boss at the end of the Pit, that's when the loot drops, and you can do several Pit runs before you're full on loot. So again, it's just greater flow. I think overall, this is actually an improvement over D3 Greater Rifts. Again, it's a 10-minute timer instead of a 15. There's pretty much no loading screens between levels. So there's no interruption of the flow. Instead of the Rift Guardian being summoned in some random place and you gotta find him, you just get a portal straight to the boss room. They're just better Greater Rifts. And it's in the Pit that you get the Masterworking crafting materials. So again, Masterworking, this is a much later game system than I expected. It is a very end game system. You're not going to be just Masterworking stuff willy-nilly as your low level. As you masterwork something increasingly, the cost ramps up increasingly, and the Pit is where you're going to get all of your materials for Masterworking. But that's fine, because the Pit's where you're going to want to be playing anyway. So again, it takes a good while before you're full up on materials, and you got to go back to town. And speaking of town, they've consolidated the craftsmen in town. We don't have to go from one end of the town to the other now. They've moved everything closer to the waypoint, all clustered together. A wonderful change. Honestly, I wish it was in the game from day one, but it is what it is. Town layouts are improved, bottom line. Also, the zoom level feels great, right? You can zoom the camera out now, or you can keep it zoomed in. When you're in town, the camera is always in the normal zoom, the zoom in, but when you leave town, you're gonna get access to the zoomed out camera. It's just an option that you set in your settings. But yeah, with the Masterworking, you have 12 upgrade levels, Every level you upgrade gives you a 5% buff to all your stats, but then every 4th upgrade, so there are 3 of them, you get a 20% buff to one stat randomly, one affix randomly. And if you get lucky enough to get it on your tempered stat, you could still re-roll the temper, and it'll maintain the masterwork. So I actually, I masterworked an item that had a bad tempered stat on it. The tempered stat got the upgrade. I was miffed by that. So I'm like, okay, let me see. If I re-roll the temper, am I going to lose the upgrade altogether? I didn't. I re-rolled into something that was a good temper for me, and now I have a 20% buff on my good temper. So that's it's something to bear in mind. Now, the build that I was playing was a double swing Twister Barbarian. I was having a lot of fun just summoning all the Twisters. I saw that Adam Jackson, the class designer, was like really into Twisters and wanted to make it a thing, and I was having a blast with it. I haven't played double swing before this rework, so I don't know how to compare exactly, but just all the Twisters all over the screen was really fun. It's also worth noting that there was no season theme. Everything that we're experiencing in the test server, that's just going into the base game. They haven't even revealed the Season 4 theme yet. They're calling it the Season 4 PTR. It's it's really Diablo 4 2.0 PTR. But yeah, I guess that about sums up my initial impressions. Again, at the start, I was very dismayed, but it won me over in a big way. When I got to actually playing and experiencing all the systems, I was having a lot of fun. Now, asterisk. Does that mean that Diablo 4 is saved? This was after one day of playing. In a week, are there going to be issues that crop up that I didn't think would be a problem? Is the novelty of all this going to wear off? Am I going to start getting bored with some systems? Are some of these things going to start to become tedious? When that new car smell goes away, how am I going to feel? How are we all going to feel? We'll have to see. But right now, I think there's a lot of promise, and I will give an update post-PTR on what warts have begun to show themselves. I'll probably also highlight things that I would like to see changed. Maybe still improvements that need to be done. But again, for now, very pleased with what I'm seeing, but I turn the question to you folks. What are your thoughts? Sound off in the comments. Again, if you haven't seen the video going over all the patch changes, they are here. Otherwise, thanks for watching. Special thanks to my Twitch, Patreon, and YouTube supporters for making these videos possible. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to join Rhykkers Raiders for more ARPG content.